Afternoon. At my family's request, I've been asked to make a DVD on how to build these recurve bows that have kind of been in the family for quite some time. The bows forms were built by Dick Green back in the 1940s. He built bows, and as young children, my brother and I, my dad, we all grew up shooting these custom-made recurve bows by Dick Green. When my dad was forced into retirement at a fairly young age, it just happened to be at the time when Dick Green was having health issues, probably from breathing too much fiberglass for so many years, affecting his lungs, that my dad inherited the bow forms and business from Dick Green. So we grew up shooting these bows, and I think I was 16 or 17 or whatever when I built my first recurve bow with my dad's guidance. Donald Guthormson would be his name. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you all the nuances that go into making these recurve bows. They are not American manufacturer organization standard. When you buy a commercial bow, those bows all have to fit into certain parameters. For example, a 64-inch bow has to be able to string a 60-inch string. Well, that takes away some of the creativity and design and things because, well, now you have to make a bow that shoots well and properly within that perimeter. So I have found that these Dick Green bows shoot much better not following the American manufacturer's code for archery, or what is it? Archers Manufacturers Organization Standards is what it is. And so because of that, how long the strings are and how they're tillered and all these things and how they're done are different. All right, so that's what we're going to show you. I'm going to show you how I go about this. You don't have to have all the equipment that I have in this shop. For example, the real thin laminations and things, you can in fact have those made and ordered through companies like Old Master Crafters and Bingham Products is what it is. They've made stuff for bow builders for many years. Consequently, you don't have to have this equipment. However, it is much better if you can build the stuff yourself. I used a homemade thickness sander for years and rebuilt a new one and had trouble with it and couldn't get it to work as nice as I particularly like, so I broke down and bought a commercial sander. But you don't have to do that. You can go to Fine Woodworking, look up thickness sanders, and they'll show you plans to make one if you want. It'll cost about $200 to make one, as opposed to about $1,000 to buy one. But I think you're better off if you save your cash a bit and buy a commercial one. Anyway, that's my own personal lesson, is I would have been better off to have done that. Okay, so first thing you do is start out with rough stock. So I went to our local wood source, which is kind of expensive because Ronaldo Supply is out of business. That's kind of a funny story in itself I won't go into. But so I bought this piece of Indian rosewood, and we're going to use this basically to make the riser, which is the handle part of a recurve bow. That's going to be the base wood, is this Indian rosewood. All right. In the middle of the handle, which is the smallest part, I like to put a real strong piece of 3/8 or 1/2 inch laminate in there. And for that, what I've got is I've got some babinga, which is really, really hard. And it's hard on the tools too, mind you, but so that adds added strength. And of course, laminations make things stronger, not weaker. So consequently, putting a 3/8 inch piece in the middle, and then a thin maple laminate, then a 1/8 inch piece of Paduke, and I've actually cut those already, all right? And I start out, and these strips, well, these strips are 5/32 thick, 2 inches wide. So we're going to start with a 2-inch wide riser. The handle for the bow is only 1 3/4. However, after you've glued it all together and let it cure for the obligatory time, which with epoxy would be 24 hours to 48 hours. I like to let them set for a couple days for sure. If you're using Urac 185, which is a preferred resorcinol glue, I put them up on the rack and leave them for 2 weeks because that glue gets stronger and stronger as it ages. All right, both are good. Epoxy, unfortunately, probably the downside of the epoxy glue is at higher temperatures, epoxy will start to break down. Okay, where resorcinol glue does not. So Urac 185 is pretty good stuff. But anyway, so we've made these 5/32. These are going to be sanded down to 1/8 inch thick, and we're going to need 2 out of here for the handle, and we're going to need 4 pieces of maple, and I've already cut those 2 off a blank on the table saw to 5/32. And now I'm going to put them on the thickness sander and sand these down as thin as I can. Now, most sanders cannot sand to like 1/16 or let's say 20 thousandths of an inch thick. So what you do on the sander is you take and make a bed and place this on it, and the whole bed slides through, so it brings it up, and that way you can make thinner laminations by using a bed underneath it. That's for the riser pieces, and that's where we are now. So we're going to cut these pieces to dimension, or not to dimension, a bit oversized. Then we're going to go to the thickness sander, sand them down to the size we want, and then we'll thickness sand these to thicknesses that we want, which will be probably about 40 thousandths on the maple, 125 thousandths on the Shadua. I'm sorry, this is not Shadua, this is Padauk. Both are good woods. Padauk, much like cherry, oxidizes as it ages and will turn a little darker as it ages. What I wanted is I wanted a dark handle. That's why we use the Indian rosewood, because it's like almost as dark as walnut. It has a different hue to it because it's rosewood. All right, then we'll have the 1/8 inch strips, which will be a mild color and they'll age a little darker over time. And then the babinga, which I haven't cut yet, the 3/8 to 1/2 inch piece in the middle, that'll be kind of a peachy reddish color in the center to accent the other woods. The aesthetics, you know, making it so it looks nice is probably the hardest part. I've made plenty of bows and some of them aren't so nice. I'll show you one right now that I'm working on for myself. And to be honest about it, I don't really like the lamination structure. All right, this is it here. All right, that's the riser, and you can see in the middle, that's cocobolo, and it's very strong. It's like a rosewood, and I do not recommend using cocobolo because cocobolo is fundamentally toxic. All right, you have to wear a really good respirator all the time to work with it. It causes all kind of potential health issues. For me, it causes rashes around my eyes and any moist parts of my body. Not good. All right, that's why I haven't really worked on this a whole lot. The redder wood right in here, that is kingwood. I think it's a little soft. It's okay because I have the real hard rosewood or bimbinga would be in the center, right? So the hardness and the close grainness of the wood is important to a riser handle to keep the integrity and strength of the bow handle. So anyway, this is one that's on the go. There's nothing wrong with just building a bow out of good old-fashioned black walnut. It's just a darn nice looking bow. This bow here is just basically what I would call a commercial bow. All right, it's just black walnut. Of course, it'll be much darker when it's oiled up and everything. It's got dust on it from sitting in the rack. And consequently, you can see the laminations on this. It'll be a nice bow when it's finished. And there's nothing wrong with this. This is what I call a shooter. It's not fancy, it's nothing, but you'll go out and you kill deer with it or whatever you want. It's nice having cosmetic parts, like you see the little thin maple laminations. These laminates here are 25 thousandths, and it comes right out into the tip on both sides. Just add a little accent to it. The lamination here and here, maple with the walnut in the middle, the 1/2 inch piece, that adds strength in the part of the bow. It has the greatest amount of stress on it, okay? All right, this bow here is the type of handle I'm kind of making for the bow. I'm not going to have the double mountains right here on the top, but this is fundamentally, I prefer this particular riser style. If you look in the middle here, All right, there is the 1/8 inch strip in the middle. The thin maple laminates are 3/8 down the center, and then another 1/8 surrounded by 25 thousandths maple lamination. And on the back I have a piece of cocobolo here and here. I don't work with cocobolo anymore. It's just not a good wood for Dale to work with. So anyhow, and of course on the tips of the bow, ultimately you like something on the tips here that's going to actually match the rest of the bow. On this one, I'm not sure what I have on there. I'd have to oil it up to actually see. All right, so that's where we're at. This is where we're headed. So what we're doing is we're cutting the wood to make the riser part of the bow first. Any questions? Now, what I want to talk about is, since I'm making this actually for my family, and I suspect down the road here, somebody is going to take this stuff and make a run with it, making bows or whatever, that I have different types of bows. For example, this particular bow here, the form was developed by Pacific Archery Company, owned by Ralph Wingert back in the early 60s or so. All right, and my father built all the bows for that bow company. Whenever they had an order for a bow, this is the bow they built. Now, this bow I should call the Marsh Hawk, because the limbs on it are dihedral in shape, which means they kind of go up slightly. Now, Ralph, when he designed this bow, Ralph was a great enthusiast of archery. He's just a wonderful person, and he understood a lot of the factors about archery a lot of people don't. Like, everybody wants to shoot really far, and archery is not about making long shots and wounding or maybe killing an animal. Archery is about the sphere of influence you have on an animal and the ability of yourself to get within close enough to make it actually happen. All right, so he was always working hard to have the closest possible shot he had. And what he wanted more than anything was deep, powerful arrow penetration for hunting large game animals. Now, I made one of these bows for a guy to hunt Cape buffalo with, and the reason we used this bow form was that this bow is designed to have two parallel laminations. All right, real heavy limbs where there's a higher degree of compression, since the limb goes slightly upward here as opposed to curving going back with this more gentle reflex or deflex and reflex on the curve. All right, this bow was built to come forward, so there's more limb under compression, and with parallel laminations you get more power out of the compression part of a limb movement. So he made this bow specifically for shooting real heavy arrows with deep penetration, where you're going to be within 20 yards of your animal to hit it. And you want to shoot an elephant, you want to shoot a Cape buffalo, you want to shoot a grizzly bear, and you want to be in tight with them, which is a challenge just in itself. I would have to say that. You know, near-death experience stuff, adrenaline rushes and all that. This is the bow you want. What you're going to get with this bow, you can shoot heavy arrows, not like carbon arrows. That's a mistake. All right, you want to shoot a heavy fir wood arrow shaft with a good long two-bladed broadhead on it, razor sharp. All right, so you're going to, instead of shooting an arrow that weighs 300 grains, you're going to shoot one that weighs 900 to 1500 grains, depending on the weight of your bow. And then when it hits the animal, you're in close. You're not worried about trajectory and all these things that come along. The further out you shoot, the more ballistically difficult it becomes with an arrow, or a rifle for that matter. So consequently, the goal with this bow is in close, deep penetration. That's what this bow is about. And this bow here is really quite old. Made was glued together in about 1972 or 3, and it's still a good shooter. And I saved this bow if I'm going to go black bear hunting or do something on the wild side, hunting big dangerous game. This is the one you want. And you might want to have your 45 on your hip at the same time, but better practice enough to make sure the shot counts. So anyway, whoever in the future gets my headhunter form, which is a solid aluminum form, by the way, it'll be good. Well, archaeologists will find it in 10,000 years and wonder, what is this? All right. And my other forms, the green forms, are wood forms with aluminum backing and things like that. And that is the solid aluminum headhunter form, original Pacific Archery Company form back in the Dark Ages. What we're going to do is we are going to work on the thin strips first. I'm not going to show you all the process. I know both my sons know how to use a table saw. Taught them how to do that when they were in high school, so no big deal. It's down to, it's a typical S2S board. Two sides are planed. It's about 13/16 thick. I'm going to cut it 2 inches wide. I'm going to clean the first edge off, flip it over, clean the second edge. Then I'll put the second edge to the fence because that is now the straightest edge. Then I will cut a 2-inch wide strip. All right, so that's what we're going to do right now. I'm not going to run the tape the whole time. That'd be a waste of your time. Alright, dust is a problem. I've got a vacuum sucking dust out of the bottom of the saw. Probably should wear a respirator if I was young. At this point, I don't know if it matters. Okay, so there's our 2-inch piece. It's 2 inches wide. Alright, so now what we're going to do is we're going to flip it on edge. And we're going to cut a 1/2 inch wide piece. So that I can then thickness sand it so both sides are smooth and clean. And that'll be the center part of the riser. Set the fence for a 1/2 inch. Okay, I'm going to point something out here. If you have to buy a square, don't go down to your PV Mart to buy a combination square and spend $15 or something. The only ones that are actually accurate and measure perfectly and are 100%, 90% square all the time are Starrett Wade combination squares. They are not cheap. This little one was $79 and worth every penny. It's one of your most used tools. If you're going to buy woodworking tools, one of the first things you buy is a Starrett Wade square. You can get them online through Lee Valley or wherever. First class equipment. Don't buy cheap. You'll pay the price for it. I know because I've done it. We've set the fence. Make sure it's locked down. It's real easy to forget that. You get all excited here. And next thing you're cutting and it starts sliding to the side. So we're going to avoid that. Make sure it's locked down. All right, now this cut, make sure the blade is no more than like 1 carbide tooth above it. If anything happens, your hands go in there. All right, you're only going to lose a groove out of your finger, not your whole finger. And always use a push stick and keep your hands away from the damn blade. All right, it will make a mess of you in a heartbeat. You can't even think that fast. Yep, let me show you something. Now look down your board. All right, if the board has a slight curve in it, if you put it in curved to the fence, it'll be thinner in the middle and the side. So if it has a slight bow, flip it over so the bow's this way, because what you can do is you can keep it firm to the fence here and it'll be out from the fence here like this one. See that? All right, so I'll keep it firm to the fence at just in front of the blade all the way through. And then the straightness will come when we sand it on both sides. And then we clamp it together, all's wonderful. Okay? All right, there you go. There is our 1/2 inch piece, which we are going to thickness sand down both sides real nice. So we have all our pieces. Now what we have to do is determine the major handle piece, how big it's going to be. But we're going to do that a little later. We're going to go ahead and get all these other laminates ready. This is important. Now on your table saw, if you go ahead and buy yourself a high quality table saw blade, if you have a table saw, as far as I'm concerned, there is only one brand of table saw blade that is good enough, and I'll show you why. All right. Now, if you look at this stock, all right, there are no cut marks on the side at all. You see that? Most saw blades leave all kind of little semicircular marks and things. Look at this. It's been cut on both sides. No marks, all right? Now, this piece could actually be glued up as it is. It really does not need to be thickness sanded. What I recommend then is by thickness sanding, what you do is it puts a real fine roughness on it. It puts little grooves in both sides. So when you glue it together, you get better adhesion, okay? And on exotic woods, there are plenty of exotic woods, cocobolo being one of them, that they don't adhere as well to other woods. It's worthy of roughing the surfaces. You can't rough them by hand or anything because it makes nuances and things. So having a machine to do it that'll keep it straight and true is pretty important. Building a thickness sander like I did for years worked fine mostly. I couldn't make it perfectly parallel, and if yours isn't parallel, let's say it's 6 thousandths out, you run it through, then you bring it back without changing adjustments. You flip it over and then run it through again, so the low side goes through and the high side gets brought down. That makes it virtually parallel. Now, if you're making laminations and they aren't perfectly parallel on the ends, all right, they can be really, really close. I like mine perfect, all right? Nothing less will do. My sander is 1/2 of 1,000th out over a 6-inch span. So if I'm doing 2 inches, that's 1/3 of a 1/2 of a thousandths out. Now, it probably doesn't matter enough to make a difference. Your bow will probably shoot better than you're capable of shooting it, all right? But what you can do is when you put your laminations together, for example, I'll use 2 different colored pieces. So what happens, if this is a little bit wider here, you flip it over so that the little wider side on this one is on this side and the thinner one is on this side. So now when you clamp them together, you have a perfectly parallel limb. Now you shouldn't do it if you're hugely out. If you don't have a thickness sander for laminations, I recommend just spending the bucks and going to Old Master Crafters and buying some laminations. All right, they're already pre-ground. They're actually quite accurate. I've measured dozens and dozens of them, and they're never out more than a 1/2 a thousandth of an inch over 2 inches. All right, so you measure them, check them, and flip them so they're opposing each other, and you have a perfectly parallel limb structure. Really important. Commercial bows do not pay attention to that. I've measured commercial bows, and it's amazing how out they are. And you know what? Those bows still shoot better than most people can shoot them. But, you know, if you're going to build your own bow, you should build it the best it can possibly be, at least within your skill range and equipment ability. This is a detail that makes sense. That's my thickness sander. It's a Grizzly brand thickness sander. All you're going to do is little bow laminations. Then you can buy yourself a little 12-inch laminator. All right, from here to here it's 18 inches. It's an open-ended sander. So if I want to build something, I can thickness sand something 36 inches wide. All right, you don't need that for just bows. You can get a 12-inch thickness sander from Grizzly like for $400. I mean, heavens, that's 3 nights out at the pub. So, well, maybe for you it's 1, I don't know. It's worth getting. It will make your job much more pleasurable and a lot more fun. It's always nice to have cool tools too. Now my scrap on this was kind of nice. I got a 3/8 inch piece. I'll be able to make another bow riser with this. Save your scraps. They burn real nice if you got a fireplace, but man, at $35 a board foot for Indian rosewood, and I believe the Babinga was 16, and a board foot is 12 inches by 12 inches by 1 inch thick. So figure that out. To build a really nice custom bow handle with exotic woods is going to cost about 150 bucks. But sometimes you got to buy bigger pieces than you need. So save your pieces, because most of the small stuff you can use other things. And the little pieces, you know what? You can make really exotic high-end jewelry boxes or anything you want. Whatever your creative heart desires. Don't scrap the wood. It does make good firewood, but it seems kind of a waste. So I just ran those through the thickness planer, and I planed both sides. If you look at this, you can just see right here, there's a bit of a table saw mark on there. Now this thickness sander can only go to 1/8 of an inch, which is 25 thousandths. So if I want to sand this any further, I need to actually put a platform under it and run it through. I was talking about having a platform, so what I have is I have this piece which is parallel, and I'm going to go and lay this on top of this thicker piece. So now I can make these thinner, you see? All right, this will raise it up so the sander can come down and I can make it as thin as I want because I'm using this for a backing. These are the ones that we used the backing on so we can make them really thin. So what we have is we can see what our boat is gonna look like in the center, the handle. Of course there'll be Indian rosewood on the two sides of this. It'll all be darker when it's oiled, right? That's how it is. I think it'll look better with a slightly thinner strip in the middle. And the piece that I use for the backing is only about, well, instead of 375 thousandths, it's probably about 300. And so we'll put that in there. And you see the proportions look better there with the slightly wider piece there. All right, I have the piece of Indian rosewood here. And what I've done is taken my laminates and placed them here. Now this piece of wood here is just not part of the handle. I just put it there to keep everything flat. So what I wanted to do is lay in the template for the riser. Now I've got 3 holes on here, one in the center. Now I put that on the center piece that's going to go in the center of the handle. Now these 2 holes here, they allow me to line it up to this maple strip here and here, so I actually have it squared up. So once I have that, now I know on this particular piece of stock, I can trim off about 3/4 of an inch of Indian rosewood here, which is great because that gives me the other piece that I can put up on top for these pieces up here that are beyond that laminate. All right, that's how I'll judge that. Of course, once you're building these, you can just write this stuff down so you know if this is the type of riser you like to build with these laminates every time. Then you just cut everything to dimension because you'll have written them down. However, if you want to be creative, then you're going to have to do your laminates and lay down your template so that you know exactly where they're going to fall in the handle, and you can also determine how long to cut your stock. Like the piece on the top here is going to be about 12 inches long. You see that? So when I cut that, I am going to cut that top piece of Indian rosewood. It's going to be 1 inch by 12 inches, and that'll go in there. So you'll have East Indian rosewood on each side. Now this is just one riser shape. Let me run this up. All right, this particular riser here has been around forever. It's a number 2 riser. It's smaller. It makes a smaller handle, such as in this particular bow right here. And when you're all done, it makes for a small, tight, tidy bow. All right, I also have a larger riser, which will make, as you can see, it's substantially larger. This is number 3, and if I'm making a takedown, I use this because I'll be cutting across here with a jig to make the bow into a takedown bow. Personally, I'm not big on takedown bows. I have one, and I never took it apart. Once it was together and everything's tuned right, I always kept it together. So what was the point? But if you want to take down just for presentation purposes and make a nice case and stuff, the number 3 riser is the one to use. Or if you have some of the really large hands. And the other thing, if I'm building a bow, like when I built the bow for shooting Cape Buffalo, I used a number 3 riser because the bow was 86 pounds. you need a heavier, stronger handle with that kind of weight. So that's what the number 3 riser is for. Once you have the block made, you can shape these handles any way you want, as long as they're strong enough to deal with the poundage. You don't want them breaking at the handle. Broken bows hurt. I have cut all the pieces. The small pieces here are 13.5 inches long. That gives us enough room to put the riser on there. And I've set things up. I have my clamps here. Now you can use C-clamps and things, but I have homemade clamps that I made because I use these on the bow forms as well. And they apply good even pressure. I have clamps ready. You can use C-clamps or squeeze clamps, whatever clamps you want, as long as you put a reasonable amount of force on it. C-clamps, you can put so much force on, you can squeeze all the glue out of the joint. So you have to be pretty careful. Plus, C-clamps have a propensity, because they turn, they want to twist the board like this. So if you're going to use C-clamps, then you got to put a clamp on the sides to keep it from shifting. And that's actually a good idea no matter what. So we're going to glue this riser up. I'm going to mix my glue, get everything ready, get a spreader. I put a mark on here. I split the 13.5 each side of center, so when I glue and lay those on, I'll actually have them in the right place. And I can also watch to keep them from slipping, all right, because they're going to want to slip, so you don't want that to happen. You could glue gun tack a little block on each side to keep them from moving if you wanted, and then take them off, because this is going to all be trimmed off later anyway. I'm just careful about it, but it's not a bad idea to put a stop blocks on the riser. I don't have a hot glue gun, so that isn't going to work for me. I just have to be careful. We're going to glue this riser together. Now there's a couple things. Of course, I talked about epoxy and Urac 185 before. If you're going to use epoxy, you can get this G2 epoxy real readily. I order it through Lee Valley, and I use it for handles. You can even use it for the limbs and the bows and stuff. For limbs, you can use smooth-on epoxy, or you can buy epoxy from Bingham Products. I have no idea what it is. I think it's a 604, but they put their own name on it, so you don't really know. But this stuff is really quite good. If you add a little more Part B, because it's 60-40, 2-to-1 parts or whatever it is, but if you add a little extra of the Part B to it, it actually makes the epoxy a little more elastic. So if I use G2 to make the bows, instead of mixing it 60-40, I might mix it 60-45. But it'll work fine if you just follow the instructions exactly. For measuring, what I do is I use these small measuring cups, and they have little marks on the sides. Again, a Lee Valley product. Get 100 cups for like $3. And 2 of these cups will glue an entire bow. So the glue goes quite a ways. If you buy that much glue, you'll be using it for a long time. And the nice thing about the epoxy is the shelf life on it is forever. If it thickens and hardens up and crystallizes slightly, take the bottles, put them in hot water or microwave them carefully, and heat them back up until they liquefy, and then the epoxy is perfectly good again. The only time I had an epoxy that didn't work for me is I used smooth-on epoxy, glued 5 bows together, and had all 5 bows fail. I don't know what I did wrong. Maybe I squeezed it too tight or whatever. The good thing about epoxy is it's a good gap filler. So if you have slight nuances in the glue joints and things, the epoxy will fill in those nuances and keep the integrity of the bow pretty much intact. Alright, so we're going to do this right now. Let's just double check and see what it says on 2-to-1 proportions. So I'm going to look on here. I can find drams, tablespoons, cc's. I like cc's. If I have 30 cc's, I want about 10 to 12 cc's of Part B. That's not a lot of glue. I would recommend you have some paper towels on hand, soap and water. Okay, that is approximately 12. I would like just the slightest bit more. So I'm just going to take a nail. I use a galvanized nail. I'll pull it out and just let it drip in. And that way I'm not getting too much in at a time. And you got to keep it over the cup though. Now what we can do is we can just top this up to 30 cc mark. Just right about there. I'm kind of used to doing this. Alright, so now once this goes into the tube, this nail cannot go back and rest on the lid or anything, or you're going to put both types of epoxy on the lid, and guess what? It is going to glue closed. I've done that too. So when you get this mixed up really well, it gets almost a little pearlescent look to it. It's really kind of nice. Now this is not a fast cure. Never use fast cure epoxies, all right, because they become more crystalline and more brittle. All right, so there will always be epoxies available of all kinds, but if you come up here, if I tilt this, I really can't. You see it's kind of a creamy color. All right, so whip it, mix it really well, and let it set for about 5 minutes. All right, you wipe one lid off with a bit of paper towel. Don't use it on the other lid, or again, you'll glue your lids shut. So it's easy to do this stuff wrong. Before you pour, always wipe off the edges. They collect dust and things, and you don't want particles going into your actual bow handles. Under the bench here, I have a box down there. You see the light coming out of the edges. That box is about 7 feet long. It might be 8 feet, but that box is my heat box. It has 4 light bulbs in it. You see, and that rack is to set the form on, or bow on there. When I put them in there, that's going to heat up. I have a little thermostat in there, so when it gets to 160 or 70 degrees, it turns it off, and then we'll turn it back on. You can get those little thermostats from Bingham Products. You need that to cure the epoxy. I suppose you could glue it and leave it for a couple weeks and it would harden. We're at the glue table. I always brush them off before I glue them, okay? Just to get the dust and stuff off. We're going to take the epoxy here, put it on the nail. I'm going to go to my line and spread the epoxy. This is probably a lot more epoxy than I probably need, which is fine. You see it spreads really well, and you want a thin coat of glue on both surfaces that are coming into contact. Glue this one from top down. Make sure there's nothing on it. You have about 45 minutes work time with this epoxy, so you don't have to rush. Make sure all the surface is in fact covered. You can see dry spots quite handily. So we're going to lay that down, line it up kind of nice on our lines. It's kind of a messy job. Probably a good idea to wear rubber gloves. Epoxy washes off with soap and water. If you totally mess up and you have to take something apart, what you do is you take it all apart and then you clean your wood with soap and water, soapy water. You clean your wood really well with that, and then you'll be able to use it again. You see I get a little tiny bead of glue in front of the nail, and I angle so it squeezes the glue towards one edge, and then I'll come back and go the other way and angle it the other way. Get a little smoother, uniform thickness of glue that way. I'm going to clean that off. Probably should have brushed that before I put it on there, but we'll get by. You can see the color of the wood too, I reckon. It's kind of nice to see what the color is going to be like when it's finished in advance. Let's brush that off. Try to make sure you don't have dry spots. I just shine it in the light and the gluey stuff reflects, and it's pretty easy to tell. You can see this wood's already wanting to creep a bit just by movement, just from sliding the glue back and forth, and the glue is stiffening up a little bit actually, probably because I heated it up a bit in front of the heater in here. It's pretty cool outside, just above freezing, and this stuff needs to be kept warm, and it was a little cool, so I put it in front of a heater to warm it up. And I don't know if that accelerates it or not, but seems to. We still have plenty of time. Dust that off. These pads I put down, you can use anything of course, but I use these. You go to the store and they have pads for dogs that pee in the house. So they pee on these pads, and so I use those as pads under the Falcons as well as for glue jobs and stuff like this. It works really good. Alright, so they're not cheap, but they're really absorbent. They prevent stuff from getting onto your tools and your table and everything. Now there's a tick of wood, so we're going to get that off. It's in a place that would be cut out anyway, but still want it right. Good afternoon. At my family's request, I've been asked to make a DVD on how to build these recurve bows that have kind of been in the family for quite some time. The bows forms were built by Dick Green back in the 1940s. He built bows, and as young children, my brother and I, my dad, we all grew up shooting these custom-made recurve bows by Dick Green. When my dad was forced into retirement at a fairly young age, it just happened to be at the time when Dick Green was having health issues, probably from breathing too much fiberglass for so many years. All right, it appears we ran out of tape. So what we're going to do now, I've finished putting the glue there and I've got this all together. Let's move it a bit here. So there's the riser block right there. So I'm going to take a bit of the excess glue off, because that's just stuff that has to be done later when it's rock hard. So let's just take it off. I'm going to plane it all down anyway. So it's all going to be nice in the end, and that's really what matters. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to take this and we're going to set it down in the heat box. And the nice thing about epoxy being in the heat box is this will be cured enough that tomorrow we'll be able to work on this, and we'll cut the face curve on the back because it's not a straight bow. It's got a slight deflex in the handle, which is part and parcel why it's such a smooth shooting bow. This bow is designed so it has about 50% deflex and 50% recurve, okay? And then we put fade outs into the recurve and off the riser to move the power into the sweet spot of the limb where you get the most amount of power out of your bow. We'll probably be making the fade outs for this bow, which is kind of fun too. If you don't have a thickness sander, haven't built one or bought one, or you couldn't use the drum thing, but you'll have to jerry rig your own taper jig, and I will show you that. This is ready to go in the hot box. So you can see that we have this riser all glued up, ready to go. Oh, a couple lights aren't working. Sometimes when I'm doing tips, I only have the ends on because you don't want to heat the whole bow. Okay, so there's your riser in the heat box. There are 4 200-watt light bulbs in that box. That's going to heat that up and give us enough heat. Alright, this is tape 3. Alright, and we have, I'm going to redo part of the riser work here. Alright, here we go. We have the riser, it's all thickness to the right thickness. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to square it up and lay out the curve that is going to fit the form. Now, as you can see, this is a curve, all right? And your bow form has a slight deflex in the riser, and that's difficult to work with. That's why so many bows are made with straight backs, so they're quick and easy. They don't shoot as nice and as smooth, but that's why it's done. But this one is made for shooting, so what we've done is we've made templates to match the form, and a jig for the drum sander on the drill press behind me to sand it so it fits into the form perfectly. So when it's clamped together, all the laminations come smoothly together, press and make proper glue seams without waves or gaps in it or anything like that. Now, epoxy is a good filler, of course, and consequently, if you have a slight nuance in the riser, it'll probably be all right. But it's worth taking the time, if you've built your own form, to make a jig that sets right in the form perfectly, and line the form with cork, so when it's clamped down and pressed in, the cork actually presses in any nuances you have and helps press and make a better lamination. That's why all my forms are lined. I used to have them lined with the backs of what you put on a drafting table, and it worked really, really well, and I like them. But now nobody uses drafting tables, it's all computerized, so you can't get that. And so I'm back to using cork like Dick Green did back in the 1940s and 50s. All right, so anyhow, so what we're going to do is, I have the center line marked on the riser. We want the template to set in the riser perfectly so we can do all these cuts and everything fits nice. So what we do is we just lay it out, put the center hole, remember I have a hole in the center of the riser, that's going to go in the 1/2 inch or 3/8 inch centerpiece of Babinga. And now I'm going to make sure the curves for the limb stay within the perimeters of the wood I have laminated. And of course I made this very accurate. I'm right on the money. So we are going to go and I'm going to take and mark the center. I'm going to use my square, and I'm not going to mark just the sides, I'm going to mark it all the way around. The sides that aren't being cut. Alright? We have the center line. I need to put this back on where I had it, because I'm going to take the bandsaw and I'm going to cut just the bottom. After we've done this and we've formed it on the drum sander, then we're going to glue the face lamination on first. And we're going to bandsaw just outside the line, because we're going to drum sand the rest off. I could at this point actually trim off the little extra off each end, but I'm not going to do that. We can do that later. Alright, so now I have laid out the line. It's not real easy to see, so you need good light when you do this. So we're going to go to the bandsaw and we're going to cut that piece of rosewood off. And as I said, we need to cut the curve in the back of the riser. Now, there are a couple ways to accomplish that. We could use a hand coping saw. That's this, and you could cut that out by hand. You don't have to have power tools. And actually, this does a pretty good job. And you can get one of these for anywhere between $12 and $20. The one from Lee Valley is 20 bucks and works really good. This one was $8, and it's not as adjustable as I like. I should buy a better one. Or you can use a jigsaw. Hand jigsaw, just stay out from the line and go slow so it cuts a straight. Jigsaws are prone to start cutting at a slight angle, and if you stay close to the line and don't know it, it will cut in, and then that'll reduce the size of it. Sometimes power tools aren't the best answer, but it works well if you go real slow and have a good blade on it. And have a new blade. Don't use one that's partially dull. Alright, so those are things you can do if you don't have the power tool. You like the bandsaw. That's not an expensive bandsaw. It's a little 14-inch clone of a Delta. If you want to buy a good bandsaw for economical prices, look up grizzly.com. They have some really good 14-inchers, varying anywhere from $400 and some up to whatever you want to spend. I prefer the bandsaw, just a little easier, and you use it for lots of other things as well. As Ryan called these, I think he called these birth control glasses, but they're my close-up glasses. Remember to stay just outside the line. This afternoon what we're doing is we're making laminations for the limbs. If you don't have the tools, you can go to Bingham Products or Old Master Crafters and buy tapered laminations. Now, the tapered laminations I like to use in the limbs for our bows are 2/1000 of an inch taper per inch. We're going to make these from scratch as opposed to buying them. And it's really not hard. I got Chip and Ira in the background there making noise. So what we're going to do is, what I did is I took some northern hard maple. I cut it on the table saw down to just over 1/8 of an inch. 1/8 of an inch would be 125 thousandths. And you'll need 4 of those. 2 at about 36 inches and 2 at about 33 inches. So just make them all 36 inches, and then you'll just cut them down to fit. 73 pounds with it, which is real heavy. Most people have trouble with that, but having grown up shooting bows, I could handle that. Now as I've gotten older, that weight's too heavy, so I moved that bow on to another member of the family, and I've built myself a 43-pound bow to hunt with. If you want to, in the 40-pound bracket, you put a 40 thousandths piece of glass, 2 100 thousandths taper laminations, and another 40 thousandths glass. Now if you want to up to 45 to 50 pounds, then you'll go with a 40 thousandths glass, a 100 thousandths taper laminations, 2 of them, and another 50 thousandths fiberglass. So 40, 100, 150. And if you want to go heavier, then I recommend going with a 50 thousandths, 50 thousandths, and 2. You can go with a 100 and a 110 for 60 to 63 pounds, and go a little higher than that. Go with 2 110s and 2 50 thousandths, and you can crank the bow weight up even heavier. Now, of course, you have some latitude with that because the width of your limbs make a difference, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. All right. This particular bow here, I've made fairly light, and it's fairly thin. It's thinner than my finger. It's probably about 1/2 to 9/16 wide on the tip, a very narrow limb. And now what you will find is that if you tiller to a narrower limb, which is more difficult but worth doing, you have a much smoother shooting bow because there's not as much mass suddenly stopping at the end. And on a wider bow, for example, this one, which is pretty rough still, but you can see on this one, you know, it's quite a bit wider than my finger. Now this bow is made a little heavier, the limbs are a little wider. It will shoot fine, but it'll shoot a little rougher. When the arrow reaches the end, there's a bit more of a physical thump at the end, not as smooth as a narrower limb bow. You want the nicest shooting bow you can have. You want the limbs to narrow down real nicely. This particular bow has a 50 thousandths, a 40 thousandths. It has 2 tapers in it, and it is right now at approximately 52 pounds. All right, so that gives you a little information on that. Of course, you can experiment, and every batch of glass is not necessarily the same. You have this latitude, and of course the width, the narrowness of the limbs and all that, and whether or not you put fade outs in the limb or not. I have a bow here. This is a pretty fancy bow. Now this is an easier bow to build. If you're building your first bow, this might be the one to build. Well, and this one has 250 thousandths. This is a fairly heavy bow, but it has a parallel lamination that is, I think, as I recall, it's 60 thousandths of an inch all the way down. All right, parallel the whole way, and then the lamination on the back, which is this side. When you hold a bow, let's turn it around right. All right, when you hold a bow, the face is the part here that's facing you. The back is over on the other side. Now, when we were talking about compression and tension earlier, this is particularly important because if you have a parallel lamination, you want it on the compression side of the bow because that'll give you more power out of the parallel lamination, and the taper on the face side of the bow. These limbs are a little easier to tiller. They don't have the double fade outs. It won't shoot quite as fast, but to be honest about it, between 180 and 208 feet a second, which is about what these bows shoot, it's not particularly fast compared to a crossbow or some of these new high wave compounds that are so tricky to shoot with training wheels on them. Your skill with this bow is going to be in your hunting skills, not the shooting skills. Shooting skills are important, but your hunting skills will do you a lot more service than trying to be accurate out to 40 yards and things like that. You have a thicker fiberglass and a thinner fiberglass, say it's a 50 and a 40. You want to put the 50 fiberglass on the back, so when the bow bends back this way, this side is under compression, this side is under tension. The compression, as it returns, will give you more power than the tension part returning to its original form. And the sweet spot on a bow is right in here. This section of the limb in every bow is the part that yields the greatest amount of power out of a bow. Now, the problem with an American manufacturing organization standard is they don't let you do special things. So I put a fade out of 5/1000 of an inch per inch from here right down to about here. It fades into nothing. And off the riser part, we're going to put another fade out, which is 10/1000 of an inch per inch as it fades out into the limb. And what that does is put the greatest amount of flex in the bow into the sweet spot. That gives you an upper edge on shooting power, and I believe that is worth doing. So you can make any kind of bow you want. You don't have to do the fade outs, you don't have the equipment, you don't want to bother with it. Then go with a parallel and taper lamination. If you're using the headhunter form and you're shooting real heavy arrows in close on big game animals and dangerous game, if you're hunting big game and all that kind of stuff, and you want heavy arrows, fur arrows for example, footed with black walnut on the tips, then with maximum penetration and strength, then you want to use the headhunter form with that dual parallel laminations, and that will give you that extra thumping power in close. Okay, you will not get the velocity you would off of this bow, for example, with dual fade outs and shooting faster, but it will shoot a heavy arrow better. And also, it's easier to tiller the limbs with dual parallel laminations, which a lot of commercial bows have. It's easier to tiller them so the limbs pull straight and not crooked. Taper laminations make that job a little bit more difficult, but worth the effort to learn. These is we're going to plane these down to 100/1000 of an inch thick parallel, and then what we're going to do is we're going to use a jig that will put a 2-degree taper per inch. Now, the reason we use aluminum for this is that it's not so affected by moisture and temperatures. As you know, wood moves. Consequently, that's going to be a problem if you're using wood for your jig. So what we have here is we've measured one end, all right, we took 2 degrees and we drew a line down and marked the other end, and then you can hand file each one down to a straight line, and you file down the edges, which is pretty easy with aluminum. Or if you got some cash in hand, take the channel iron to a machine shop, mill this surface perfectly true and flat, then flip it over to the machinist and tell him machine a 2-degree taper over the 36 inches of aluminum. It'll probably cost you a couple $100 maybe to have that done. But if you're going to make more than one bow, then this is worth having. And it's always nice to do it all yourself. There's some satisfaction in saying, oh, I did it myself. And someone says, well, where'd you get your laminations? Say, oh, I made them myself. To me, there's great satisfaction in that. Now, if you don't want to go to this much trouble, of course you can order in laminations from Old Master Crafters. However, it is much cheaper to buy a chunk of maple for $16, and I don't know how many laminations I'm going to get out of that chunk. I made 6 here just in case I accidentally boggle one up. I'll have a spare to make sure it's right. This making your own really makes a huge difference. Now, how you take and put them together is important. As you look at the end of these boards, the grain slants one way, okay? It's going on this one, it's slanting from left to right here, this way. So when you take your laminations, what you want is you want to flip this one, so when you put them together, the top grains are in fact going left to right, and the bottom grains of the laminations are going from right to left. Now what that does is that makes, so when it's flexed, it'll be uniform in how it pulls. If you had all the grains going one direction, it would be prone to turn one way, which isn't good. That you have to pay close attention to that when you're using full wood laminations. And there's lots of wood you can use out there. A lot of people are using yew and other woods. Now yew dampens real nice, but it doesn't give you the extra power and velocity good old northern hard maple does. You want to make a good bow that shoots fast and is pretty reasonable in all regards. You can't go wrong with northern hard maple. You can get anything you want. I do not recommend using ash. Some people make ash and they use clear fiberglass. And two problems with that. One is that ash has long grain structures and they're more prone to crack along those grain structures. That's an issue. They're also ash and oak, which are very similar, are also more respondent to humidity and moisture in the air. So I would stay away from those. And when you use clear glass, you have to use smooth-on epoxy. All right, smooth-on is a thicker epoxy, and what it does is it allows you to glue it together so that you have no air bubbles showing in the limbs. There's nothing worse than having clear glass and having air bubbles in the lamination. Of course, that is a weak point anytime. Commercial bowyers are not prone to use clear glass because it will show any flaws in the clamping. So they use brown glass, black glass, or whatever, and I'm prone to use those myself. I don't want to know if there's a flaw in my bow. I'm just going to shoot it till it comes apart, and I'll make a new one if that were the case. But you know, I'm still, my recurve, my prototype takedown recurve, which I built in 1985, is still shooting to this day. So I don't worry too much about those things. If you do your job right, the bows will last a long time. The one thing about epoxy bows, you cannot lay them on top of a car. You cannot leave them where sun will shine through a window onto the bow if they're strung. They're under force, and the epoxy will soften. The temperatures through a glass window or off a hood can reach over 160 degrees real easily, and that's when epoxy starts to break down. That's something you have to remember. Epoxy is a great product. It has its limitations like everything else. Okay, if you have gone to the trouble to make a taper jig, and that's this one here, it starts here and tapers down to this end at 2/1000 of an inch per inch the whole way. Now it's aluminum. Now what I recommend is, it's kind of a slippery surface and it should be clean. I just clean this off with alcohol. Now I'm going to put tape on here so that as it goes through, it'll hold the lamination. The tape is clean, and if anything happens and it bumps or anything, it'll bump the tape and not damage the jig. Painter's tape, blue or green, will either do it. Takes up pretty easy. When it's time to replace it, you just pull it off, scrape it with a chisel if you have to, and use some alcohol to clean it off, and it all works really well. You know, I can't tell by looking at them which ones are which, so I use a permanent marker and I mark on the end what every taper is. Alright, now the next one, of course, you lay it down and butt it right up against it. If there's a little gap, it's okay. That's better than overlapping. Overlapping will make a ridge. So you want to make sure that it all goes down smooth and doesn't overlap. And as I said, a little gap between the two rows is not bad. There, now I got it. Alright, tear it off. All works kind of nice. Alright, you can lap that over the side, but I'm here to tell you it's much easier just to take it off, because when you have to clean it up later, then this saves you some work. Alright, just take your nice sharp chisel and trim it off, just like that. Alright, ready? What we're going to do is we're going to thickness sand these down to 100 thousandths. Good morning. It's another day, and let's get this out of the way a bit. This bow riser has just come out of the heat box. And now we're kind of ready. What we're going to do is we're going to thickness sand these down to 100 thousandths. And good morning. This bow riser has just come out of the heat box. It's quite warm. Something I might mention that I hadn't thought of before is that if you don't have a heat box, you can actually get by without one. My first bow, what I did is I didn't have a heat box, so when I made the riser, I put it down in the basement and I took two little lamps with those little goosenecks on them, and I just put 150 watt bulbs in them. I think they're only supposed to have 60, whatever, but they had little metal housings around, not plastic. And I pointed those down and put them right over, so each one went right down onto the riser, and that gave enough heat that the glue sat really well. And even though it appeared to be fully cured in 24 hours, I left it for a few days just to make sure in the warm basement. This here is fully cured for sure. I can tell just by looking at the glue on the side of it. So we're going to take it apart, and then what we're going to do is this riser is 2 inches wide. So what we have to do is you have to clean the glue off at least one side, and then re-thicken this down to 1 3/4 inches. So I'll either use a table saw or a planer to take it down to just over 1 3/4. Then we'll go to the thickness sander and thickness sand it down parallel, and that's where we're at. So here's the riser. Get shaded side, that's not very good. Okay, got an overhead light here, that's part of the problem. Alright, you can see even though we wiped the glue off, there's enough pressure on the wood that still glue oozed out through the sides, and that's okay. We'll clean all that off with a belt sander. And that actually shows the pressure was pretty good, and it wasn't so much that it squeezed it all out. So I'm pretty pleased with that. It's fairly straight. It won't take much cleaning up to make it right. Now I have a standing belt sander, which I think if you're going to buy a particular tool to make bows and general sculpting woodwork and stuff, a standing belt sander, probably a 36-inch, is one of the most useful tools you can have. Mine right now, the belt's kind of loose and stuff, so I'm going to show you the cheaper way of doing it, and that's with a hand belt sander. Now, I don't use hand belt sanders very much because they are in fact the fastest way to ruin projects there is, unless you're really careful with them, because they just eat wood for breakfast. But all we want to do on this particular piece here that I've just clamped down, the riser, is to clear off the glue. I don't want to change the shape or anything. I just want to go down, take the glue down, keep it as parallel as possible. We're going to make it parallel again after we do that anyway, but it's always good not to change it any more than you have to, because belt sanders can dip and dive. This is just a cheap belt sander. I think it's a 3-inch wide by 24-inch or something like that. I didn't pay a lot of money for it because I hardly ever use them, but every once in a while it's a handy tool. If you can't afford the bigger equipment, well, this can do the job, and you'll use it for other things as well. And you're just going to move fastly. What kind of word is that? Some kind of adverb. You move fairly rapidly over it, trying to just take mostly glue and not wood. Alright, that's pretty close. There's a little bit here, and you can see that the laminations aren't on perfectly straight because I'm cutting a bit of the middle piece here of wood before getting to the glue, and that's okay. I just don't want to dip into the rosewood that much. Alright, what that'll do is allow me to... Okay, what I wanted to point out is they're working on the table here.